Welcome to History Zettel. If you are new here, this channel investigates the forgotten operations, unsolved mysteries, and buried evidence of the Second World War. Subscribe now so you don't miss the next case. On February 8th, 1942, Soviet forces completed an encirclement that trapped nearly 100,000 German troops in a pocket around the town of Demyansk in northern Russia. The temperature stood at minus 30 degrees Celsius. The nearest German lines lay over 60 miles away, across frozen swamps and dense forest. By every conventional military calculation, the trapped troops of the Second Corps were finished. But what followed would become one of the most remarkable supply operations in military history, and one of the most misunderstood. Field Marshal Wilhelm Ritter von Laeb, commanding Army Group North, faced an impossible situation. The Soviet winter offensive had shattered his front lines and created multiple pockets of isolated German forces. The largest concentration sat at Demyansk, where Lieutenant General Walter von Brockdorff-Ahlefeldt commanded 6 divisions with nearly 96,000 men. Hitler's orders were clear and uncompromising. The pocket must hold. There would be no breakout, no withdrawal, no surrender. General der Flieger Hans Jeschonek, the Luftwaffe Chief of Staff, studied the numbers with growing concern. The trapped forces required 300 tons of supplies daily to remain combat effective. At minimum, they needed 100 tons per day simply to survive. The distance from German-held airfields to the pocket measured approximately 90 miles one way. Winter weather conditions over northern Russia were among the worst in the world, with frequent blizzards, fog, and temperatures that froze aircraft engines on the ground. The Luftwaffe had never attempted an airlift of this scale or duration. However, Colonel Fritz Morzig, the Luftwaffe's chief of air transport, believed the mission was possible. He assembled a fleet of transport aircraft at bases around Pskov and Dino. The backbone of the airlift would be the Junkers Ju-52, the reliable 3-engine workhorse that had served Germany since the Spanish Civil War. Each aircraft could carry approximately 2 tons of cargo. Morzig calculated that he needed at least 150 operational transports to meet the minimum daily requirement. He would also utilize every available Heinkel H-111 medium bomber converted for cargo duty, and even pressed captured Soviet aircraft into service. The airlift began on February 18, 1942, 10 days after the encirclement was complete. The first flights landed on a hastily prepared snow-covered runway inside the pocket. German engineers worked around the clock to maintain the airstrip, clearing snow, filling craters from Soviet artillery fire, and marking the runway with burning oil drums for night operations. Soviet fighters patrolled the skies constantly, and anti-aircraft guns ringed the pocket at close range. Every flight was a gamble with death. Lieutenant Colonel Robert Kowaleski commanded the air operations inside the pocket. His ground crews worked in conditions that defied description. Mechanics repaired aircraft engines with bare hands in minus 40-degree cold, because wearing gloves made precision work impossible. Frostbite casualties among the ground personnel were nearly as high as combat losses. The wounded waited in unheated tents for evacuation flights, and many died before transport arrived. Yet somehow, day after day, the Ju-52 transports kept coming. The daily totals fluctuated wildly based on weather and enemy action. On good days, the Luftwaffe delivered over 200 tons. On the worst days, fog and blizzards grounded the entire fleet. Soviet fighters from the 310th Fighter Division hunted the lumbering transports mercilessly. The Ju-52 crews called the flight path into Demyansk the Valley of Death. Soviet flak batteries learned the approach routes and timing of the supply runs. Losses mounted steadily. By the end of March, the Luftwaffe had lost dozens of transport aircraft with their crews. But the airlift continued. Colonel Morzik rotated crews through the operation, giving exhausted pilots brief rest periods before sending them back into the frozen hell. Transport Geschwader 1, 2, and 3 bore the brunt of the flying. These units had been designed for peacetime cargo operations and paratroop drops, not sustained combat supply missions in Arctic conditions. The Ju-52 aircraft themselves were pushed far beyond their design limits. Engines failed from the extreme cold. Wings iced up in clouds. Overloaded transports crashed on takeoff or landing. The survivors kept flying. Inside the pocket, General Brockdorff-Ahlefeldt rationed supplies with ruthless efficiency. Ammunition took priority over food. Medical supplies came before winter clothing. The defenders of Demyansk existed on starvation rations, supplemented by whatever could be scavenged from captured Soviet positions. Horse meat became a staple. Frostbite cases overwhelmed the medical stations. Yet the perimeter held. German artillery, resupplied by air, broke up Soviet attacks with devastating precision. The Luftwaffe delivered an average of 265 tons per day over the 72 days of the main airlift operation. This figure exceeded even the optimistic estimates. From February 18th to May 18th, 1942, the transport fleet flew approximately 33,000 sorties into Demyansk. They delivered over 24,000 tons of supplies by air and evacuated over 22,000 wounded. The cost was severe. The Luftwaffe lost 265 aircraft, including 106 Junkers Ju-52 transports, 17 Heinkel H-111 bombers and various other types. This represented more than half of Germany's annual production of transport aircraft. 387 aircrew were killed or captured. The operation proved that large-scale airlift could sustain an encircled force under specific conditions. What were those conditions? First, the distance was manageable. 90 miles one way allowed multiple sorties per day per aircraft. Second, the pocket was large enough for proper airfield facilities. Third, German fighter cover could protect the transports for most of the route. Fourth, the trapped force was strong enough to defend the landing zone. Fifth, weather, though terrible, permitted flying operations on most days. Most importantly, the Luftwaffe committed sufficient resources without initially diverting aircraft from other critical missions. In April 1942, German ground forces launched Operation Bridging Strike to relieve the Demyansk pocket. After brutal fighting through snow and swamps, they opened a narrow land corridor on April 21st. The airlift had succeeded. Hitler was jubilant. The Luftwaffe had performed a miracle. General Jesenek received congratulations from the Führer himself. Hermann Göring, Commander-in-Chief of the Luftwaffe, proclaimed that German air transport could sustain any encircled force anywhere in Russia. This conclusion was catastrophically wrong. What the German High Command failed to analyze were the unique circumstances that made Demyansk possible. The operation had severely depleted the Luftwaffe's transport fleet. Losses in aircraft and trained pilots could not be easily replaced. The distance, weather, and defensive perimeter at Demyansk represented nearly optimal conditions for an airlift. Most critically, the operation had lasted only 10 weeks before ground relief arrived. General der Flieger Martin Fiebig, who would later command Luftflotte 4's transport operations at Stalingrad, studied the Demyansk data carefully. His report warned that the operation's success had created dangerous illusions. He noted that the transport fleet was now depleted, that pilot training programs could not replace losses quickly enough, and that Demyansk's relatively short duration had prevented the complete exhaustion of resources. His warnings were filed away and forgotten. 10 months later, in November 1942, Soviet forces encircled the German Sixth Army at Stalingrad. This pocket contained over 290,000 men, nearly 3 times the force at Demyansk. The daily supply requirement for the Sixth Army to remain combat effective was 750 tons. Even survival required a minimum of 300 tons daily. The distance from German airfields to the pocket was 180 miles initially, then increased as Soviet advances captured forward bases. Winter weather over the Volga steppe was even more severe than at Demyansk. The Sixth Army's defensive perimeter was larger and harder to defend. Soviet air power had grown massively since the previous winter. When Hermann Göring assured Hitler that the Luftwaffe could supply Stalingrad by air, he cited Demyansk as proof. General Jeshenek supported this assessment, remembering the triumph of the previous spring. Neither man conducted a realistic analysis of comparative conditions. The Luftwaffe committed roughly the same number of transport aircraft to Stalingrad as had served at Demyansk, despite the vastly greater requirements and far worse conditions. The airlift began with confidence born of past success. It failed catastrophically. Over 71 days, the Luftwaffe delivered an average of only 117 tons per day, less than half of even the minimum survival requirement, and barely 1/6 of what was needed for combat effectiveness. The Sixth Army starved and froze. Soviet fighters and flak destroyed the transport fleet piece by piece. 488 aircraft were lost, along with over 1,000 experienced air crews. By February 1943, the German Sixth Army had surrendered, and the Luftwaffe's transport capability was shattered beyond repair. Demyansk had taught the Luftwaffe that airlift could save an encircled army. But the lesson they learned was incomplete and dangerous. Success at Demyansk required specific conditions that would never be repeated. The operation had worked not because air supply was a universal solution to encirclement, but because a unique combination of factors had briefly made it possible. The much shorter distance, smaller trapped force, shorter duration before relief, weaker Soviet air opposition, and adequate aircraft availability could not be replicated at Stalingrad. The Luftwaffe's failure to understand this distinction cost Germany an entire field army and transformed the course of the war on the Eastern Front. Thank you for watching. If this investigation gave you something to think about, please comment, like, and share. Subscribe to History Zettel and join us for the next one. The file is never truly closed.